You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're chatting with Alex Brennan, Executive Director of Futurewise in Washington State. We chat about this most recent legislative session and bills on missing middle housing, climate change, and TOD. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Impact, formerly Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues or to check out the 2023 Impact Transit and Mobility Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, visit impactmobility.org, mpactmobility.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher, or visit theoverheadwire.com. Awesome. Well, Alex Brennan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So, Alex Brennan, I'm the Executive Director at Futurewise. We're a statewide advocacy group in Washington State that is focused on land use and planning policy. And in particular, we work at the intersection between the issues of housing, transportation, food systems, and habitat conservation. We were founded in 1990 with a passage of a statewide Growth Management Act framework for how growth should happen in the state. So that's sort of the organizational background. And then my personal background, I'm a planner by training, born and raised in Seattle, and I've been in this role for 3 years and some change, so just before the pandemic started.
Oh, what an auspicious time to start.
Yes. Never a dull moment.
Well, what gave you an inkling early on that this subject matter was of interest to you? Cities, transportation, urban planning, those types of things. Was it when you're much younger, or did it come to you at a later stage?
Yeah, I've definitely been interested in these issues since I was a kid. I was really interested in kind of the neighborhood that I grew up in Seattle in the 80s. And how different it was from other places that I visited. I was lucky to live in a place where I could walk on fairly safe streets on my own as a kid to a corner store and a restaurant, and my elementary school was nearby. I really loved taking the bus. And, I'd visit my relatives in more suburban places and see how much more they had to get everywhere in the car. And I was also really interested in the kind of transformations that Seattle experienced kind of between the 80s and then into the 90s, and even more so now. We're going from kind of a place that was shrinking and dealing with a lot of economic challenges to a place that was really booming economically and struggling to accommodate growth, and what the policy strategies around that were. So I've always been kind of a policy nerd, and that's always been a particular kind of area of interest and passion for me.
That's interesting, thinking about Seattle then and now. And you think about Seattle and pop culture and how, you see it from the outside, but it's interesting to hear your story about thinking about how it changed from somebody who's lived there for a long time. I mean, obviously, we have movies like Singles and we have all the grunge stuff from the music industry and all that stuff, but there's something different that from that kind of popular imagination of the movies and television and those types of things.
Yeah, for sure. In the 70s and the 80s, people thought of Seattle as part of the Rust Belt, right? I mean, we had massive layoffs at Boeing, and it's just a really different conception than kind of the sort of the tech hub that people think of today when they think of Seattle, or even things like Starbucks and those other kind of popular conceptions of the city.
Well, which brings me kind of to today. So what are some of the challenges that the state and the city of Seattle are dealing with today? And I imagine that, kind of goes into some of the bills that you were focused on in this session of the legislature. But what are some of the issues that are vexing the state?
Yeah, so, this is not unique to Washington State, but I think it's particularly acute here. Affordability and homelessness are sort of interrelated major challenges that the state has been confronting that have been getting progressively worse for quite some years now. We've had some of the the steepest increases in home values and rents and in the number of people living on our streets that don't have a roof over their head that we've seen anywhere in the country. That has its kind of biggest challenges near our major job centers that have been growing really quickly. So near downtown Seattle, near some of the major tech hubs in the eastern suburbs of Seattle, but now is really true across the whole state. And I think that even more so the last couple of years during the pandemic, as a lot of people have been able to do remote work and move to smaller cities and towns, you've really seen those affordability challenges be present pretty much everywhere. And I think, related to that, obviously there's also an increasing sense of urgency around climate change and the need to create communities where people don't have to drive as much, where they have other access to other ways to not contribute as much to greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think those two things have really shaped a lot of the advocacy that we and a lot of our partners have been doing.
And it's been an interesting time for state level legislation on these issues, specifically housing. More and more states are hoping to implement solutions at the state level. And we've seen, places like Oregon and California do things. New York and Colorado have been talking about it, although recently it looks like they might have some trouble with it this session. Maybe in the future they'll get to it. But where do you think Washington as a state lands in terms of the state level looking for solutions to the problems that we're facing in terms of housing and homelessness and transportation?
Yeah, I think, that's been a progression for us over the last couple of years, where initially there was more focus on working on those issues at the local level. As the challenges grew bigger, and I think more cities realized that they couldn't address the problems that they're facing on their own, that we needed more regional and statewide solutions, that has pushed more of the work up to the state level. I think we're maybe a little bit behind where our West Coast, the other West Coast states are in that progression. I was on a panel about a year ago with folks from Oregon and California talking about the missing middle bills that they had passed. And when we were just starting to gear up for the preparations for this legislative session that we just completed. So, I think there's both been that progression from the local to the state level. And then I think there's also been a progression in the approach at the state level. So, we started, I guess 5 years ago now with an incentive-based approach at the state level, where the state was providing certain types of funding incentives or environmental review exemptions for local governments to take action on creating more housing options, providing more affordable housing. And then we've kind of moved from that to a model of integrating housing and affordability into our comprehensive plan process, having stronger requirements for housing elements, but still leaving a lot of leeway to local governments and how they want to implement that new framework and those requirements at the local level. And then I think particularly this last year, but kind of growing throughout that time, has been a sense that we need to have some more fixed baselines or floors for what those local requirements are going to be that the state sets. And then we still hope that, a lot of local governments are going to go up above and beyond that.
Well, let's talk about the session that just ended in Washington State. Let's talk about the TOD bill first, and then we'll talk about the positive news
okay.
for what's going on. But basically, there was a TOD bill 5466 that some would say it would have been one of the strongest statewide policies in North America. I was wondering what was in it, what was in the bill, and then where did it go wrong, or what was the pushback to the bill in the legislature?
Yeah, so the bill evolved over the course of the legislative session, but as it was first introduced, it would have set minimum density requirements near three types of transit. So near our fixed rail transit, our light rail, our commuter rail stations, near bus rapid transit stations, and then near frequent transit stops. And there were different sets of requirements for those different transit types. At the high end, for the fixed rail stations, there would have been a requirement of at least a floor area ratio of 6. So floor area ratio, for folks who aren't super familiar with it, that's basically saying if it's 6, you can have the square footage of your building can be 6 times what the square footage of the lot is. So that's where the number comes from. And so usually there's some setbacks or areas that can't be built on for different reasons. So we're talking maybe an 8-story building with a floor area ratio of 6. And then that would step down to a floor area ratio of 4 around things like just the frequent bus service. On top of that, there would have been a 50% floor area ratio bonus for affordable housing projects. So if you were doing a 100% affordable project, you could actually go up to a floor area ratio of 9 near the rail, or of 6 near the other transit stops. There were also then the elimination of parking minimums in those areas, and there were different distances from the different types of transit. So at the high end, there was a 3/4 of a mile radius from those stations, and then that stepped down to a half mile and a quarter mile.
How'd they come up with all these kind of machinations of what goes where and how much floor area ratio goes next to which stations and which types of transit and all those things? Like, I'm always fascinated by this. I mean, we had in California a number of bills, SB 50 and others, where, you said, oh, the housing can go in these employment centers and it has to be within half mile of this and then quarter mile of this, and it gets real complicated. I'm wondering how like that was developed for this specific bill, or is it a black box?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a black box, but I don't think there's like a super clean answer to that. I think there's different ideas about what a walk shed from a transit stop is, right? I mean, some people think about that as like 5 minutes at a minimum, which is sort of like a quarter mile, or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And so I think that that's kind of how those different distances were thought of. And I think there was an idea, well, we can go for the bigger distances at the transit stations that are really providing higher capacity, more frequent service. We know they're going to be there forever. There was a lot of negotiation that kind of went into the details, and I think negotiation and also trying to figure out the right balance between, what do we want and what could we actually get passed. And frankly, I think we entered the session with a bill that everybody sort of knew was probably going to, if there were going to be changes, it was going to be shrinking those heights, shrinking those distances. So the bill started out from a pretty ambitious place.
Do you find that the just kind of laying it out and kind of having the bigger discussion about it lays the groundwork for future discussions? I mean, that's kind of what happened in California. There's been a number of bills that didn't make it, but it feels like every year they built on each other to, come out successful in the end.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is the first time in a long time that we've had a TOD bill, at least with this high of a profile, in the state legislature. And it's really unusual to pass a bill the first time it gets introduced. When we get to talking about the things that did pass, and you can see that those were bills that built on being introduced in other recent legislative sessions. We did actually run a somewhat similar TOD bill back in 2009. So it's also been kind of an interesting experience to have tried to do that. We were not successful back then. A lot has changed since then, and kind of coming back into those same conversations and really restarting them this year.
I have one more question for you on this, and then we'll get to the good stuff. But I'm wondering what the pushback was. I'm wondering what the fear is, especially at the state level, because I feel like at a local level it might be easier to pass some of these types of bills where you focus on density and transit and the connections between the two. But at the state level, it might be a little bit harder, I imagine, because the constituencies are different and you have kind of a pushback from that perspective.
Yeah, I think there are things that are harder and easier about it. On the harder side, right, you're covering a lot of different places. And so there's a lot of different constituencies that need to be involved in getting support. I think the benefit is that it can be really hard when you're, especially a smaller city, or say you're just a neighborhood that's considering an upzone around your station. The impacts of just one station making a big change in zoning capacity is really different than if everybody's doing it. I think there's a lot more kind of real estate pressure that then suddenly gets kind of pointed right at you if you're going alone. So there is both a political and I also think a policy benefit to trying to take a broader approach. I think that the biggest hurdle and the biggest challenge on this, though, was around how to incorporate affordability into the zoning changes that were being made. And both, I think, disagreements from kind of the different advocacy groups that are at the table, disagreements, different philosophies on that from different legislators, and then also just kind of the complication of really different real estate markets in different parts of the state, and how do you design a program that's going to both create affordability but not overburden the finances of a development project to prevent it from happening at all in really different real estate markets.
Well, let's talk about 1110 and 1181. There's two bills that you supported that actually made it through, which is very exciting. one is bringing climate planning to the Growth Management Act, and the other is missing middle housing, which is a very popular topic around the country specifically. Can you give us a really kind of a quick overview of these two bills that were passed?
Yeah, for sure. I'll take HB 1181, which is adding climate change to the State Growth Management Act first. This is a bill that we have been working on for a couple of years now. This is the third session that it's been introduced. We are about to enter a period when all of our cities and counties are going to be updating their comprehensive plans. And so there's a sense of urgency in updating kind of what needs to be done as part of those updates. And HB 1181 does two key things. The first is it requires that those comprehensive plan updates take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In particular, as part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that they also reduce vehicle miles traveled. So while there's a broad range of climate strategies that are included, there's a real focus on how do we design our communities through our land use policies, through our street design, our transit infrastructure to reduce the amount that we need to drive. That's kind of one big component of the bill. And then the other big component is around climate adaptation. So we know that sea levels are rising. We know that areas at risk of forest fires, droughts, floods are changing. And we need to be not just planning for what those risks are now, or, unfortunately, in some cases, we're even planning based on documents that are 2 or 3 decades old. But we actually need to be looking to the future, looking at what the science is telling us about where those impacts are going to be in the future. That's 1181. We're really excited that passed the legislature. It's on its way to the governor's desk, and it's been a priority of the governor's. That bill is really complementary. It would have been really complementary to the TOD bill. Is also really complementary to the missing middle housing bill. So this is the second year that a bill like this has been introduced. It's the first year that we've been supportive of it in the past, but we got to be really deeply engaged in it in the lead up to and during this session. Kind of similar to what you were saying about the TOD bill, it has different requirements for different places. So there's some layers here, but the baseline is that all but the smallest cities in Washington state will be required to allow duplexes in what are now single family neighborhoods. In larger cities, so cities over 75,000, they'll be required to allow fourplexes, and then that goes up to sixplexes if you are near frequent transit or if you're providing affordability as part of that development. There's also an elimination of parking requirements near transit as part of that bill. And I think one other kind of key thing that is exciting and an important difference from some of the other missing middle housing bills in other states is that it allows for lot splitting as part of this. So you can, if you build a fourplex, for example, you can essentially build that as 4 townhomes, sell each of those townhomes as a fee simple building to a homeowner rather than having to condoize, and create a homeowners association for this, small 4-unit project, which has been a barrier in some other places. So those are kind of the key features of the bill, and that will start going into effect as cities update their comprehensive plans over the next couple of years.
And that was 1110, which as opposed to 1181, which was the
climate bill.
The climate bill, yes, the climate bill. Do you find it hard to keep up with the numbers? I find it ridiculously hard to keep up with the numbers. Here in California, we have so many, SBs and ABs and all that stuff, and then they change every year is a different one, right? So, if it happened or if it gets repeated a lot, like SB 35, it gets in your brain and you know exactly what it is. But if it's like one that lasted 1 year, but then it got changed to something else the next year, then you're like, is it this one or this one? I said earlier in the show SB 50, but I'm not quite sure if that's the one I was talking about. So how do you feel about the bill numbers? I mean, I guess it's necessary, right? But it is still kind of a funny way to talk about in jargon about some policy.
For sure. For the bills that we've been working on, every day for the last, however many months now, at this point, I don't have trouble remembering the bill numbers. I try to make sure I'm not just saying the bill numbers, and I'm also in that sentence always saying, what the bill is about, so that people who aren't tracking it as closely, aren't just lost in the jargon. If we have a chance to talk about, there is a suite of kind of other legislation that passed this session that's complementary to kind of those two key bills. And I do have trouble keeping track of all of the different bill numbers for those. And yeah, and it's a messaging challenge. A lot of what we do is try and get grassroots supporters from across the state involved in these advocacy pushes at the state level. So making sure that they both know the bill number so that they can sign into the right thing to express their support, but also making sure that it's accessible and doesn't feel too jargony is a big part of the challenge.
That begs another question, which is like, how do you kind of keep, because there's probably different constituencies for each of these bills, right? I imagine there's a lot of overlap, but then there's also individuals that might support one but don't support the other. How do you keep that straight from the messaging standpoint, but also how do you build the coalitions that put these bills, put them on their back and then push them through the legislature? And then how do you keep kind of from some infighting as well? I mean, it feels like there's probably some that they want to focus on their bill, and so they think your other one is the distraction. There's a whole lot of stuff going on when you're putting together a campaign for a legislative session, I imagine.
And I think that is those strategies are different, like you said, for the different bills, and they've evolved for us over time a bit. For the last couple of years, we've really been focused on these updates to our comprehensive plan requirements. So I mentioned that HB 1181 and with a different bill number in previous years, we had been bringing that to previous legislative sessions. We also did a big overhaul of the housing element requirements for comprehensive plans that passed in the 2021 session. Those two bills were part of a coordinated campaign that we had for several years that was really trying to bring together housing and environmental advocates along with a whole host of other folks from labor, business, community to unite around the shared platform. This year, we knew that the supporters for the different bills were going to be a little different. So we had to kind of restructure the way that we were doing the advocacy, where we had a sort of unified, our top three bill priorities were the TOD bill, the missing middle bill, and the climate planning bill. But we had some folks, that were with us on one and not on the other. And, so I think that just required us to message in a kind of different way. And we had a lot of different tables, and there were some tables where we were coordinating them, and there were some tables where there was someone else that was the coordinator. And I think the other big thing that has been really crucial to success is really trying to get those coalitions together early on. So, we started meeting with partners and with legislators on the missing middle housing bill pretty much as soon as the legislative session ended last year. And so by September, we had a really clear sense of what the policy was going to be, who was on board, how we were going to coordinate our work together. Whereas the TOD bill kind of came along a little bit later as an idea, and we weren't actually even really sure until right before session if it was going to happen. And so a lot of that initial legwork didn't happen as much. And I think that's was then kind of reflective of some of the challenges that we experienced during the session.
With the missing middle bill, I'm curious also what kind of some of the pushback was for that bill. Obviously there's a lot of discussion around the country about single family zoning reform, trying to figure out how to get more housing units on a parcel. But what was some of the pushback to that you saw? Obviously the bill passed, but there was probably a discussion that happened along with that bill as well.
I think people are concerned about their neighborhoods changing. There's a concern about having a one-size-fits-all approach. There were concerns about just sort of what this meant for local control over policy in general. The main organized opposition to the missing middle bill was coming from the Association of Washington Cities, which represents the cities throughout the state. And that was their primary concern, right? This is the state taking away a power that cities have traditionally had. And then you also saw organizing at the local level with people concerned about changes in their neighborhood. I think that the sort of not in my backyard phenomenon, and there are certainly like undercurrents of classism and racism around fears of different types of people moving into a neighborhood. I think there's also, for a lot of people, it's a big adjustment to think about what housing types might be in their neighborhood and what that's going to mean. And if you've never lived in anything but a single family neighborhood, that just sort of uncertainty can be scary. So ultimately, the biggest thing and kind of the thing that was really upsetting for us, but we felt like was better than not having anything pass, was we ultimately needed to allow the smaller cities in the Seattle metro to have lower requirements. I mentioned before, they're just doing duplexes. Originally, everybody, if you were part of the sort of contiguous urban area with Seattle, everybody was going to have the same requirements as the big cities. And that was really important to us because part of the goal for us is around addressing the segregation that comes from more exclusionary zoning practices in wealthier, more expensive suburbs. And so we were able to chip away at that a little bit with the ultimate bill, but not as much as we had hoped.
I want to ask a question about something that's been eating at me kind of for the last 24 hours. And I recently posted an article in my newsletter from Professor Dana Cuff at UCLA, who said basically suburbs are a climate disaster. And I got one response from somebody I won't name who said it's time to chill out a bit with respect to the anti-suburban bias and strive for more balanced planning solutions. I'm wondering, how can we get bills through states when we have this kind of opposition? And I'm wondering what you do about all these folks who think that balance means not touching single family neighborhoods, which is what I think I'm interpreting that to mean is let's balance. I heard yesterday in Culver City they got rid of a bike lane, right? And I think it was either the mayor or one of the council members we need more balanced transportation or we need to compromise more. And it's but 99% of the transportation policy is cars. So how is it a compromise to take out a bike lane?
I think it's a similar issue to any kind of major change, right? People think of the status quo as sort of the natural thing or the reasonable compromise. And so when you're pushing for something different, you really have to change the way that people think about things, and you're going to get pushback. Sometimes when people say something like that about suburban cities, one other way that I interpret it is, there's nothing helpful about insulting suburbs and people that live in suburbs, right? And I very wholeheartedly agree with that. I think if we get into a sort of holier than thou, people who live in central cities are better for because they don't have to drive as much or whatever, I think that really hurts the cause for the land use changes that we're trying to make. And it's kind of ignorant of the real estate dynamics around how much it costs to be able to live. In these cases, in many of those central cities now, we don't have enough of those kind of walkable, transit-oriented, denser places for everybody to be able to have that. So that's the piece that I really do try and hold on to, and also think about. I think one of the good things about missing middle, from our perspective, is it's not a big change for most single family neighborhoods. You have a fourplex next door, you may not even know that it's a fourplex unless you look really closely. And that's really different than, having an 8-story building next door to your single family home. And so I think being aware of the degree of change you're asking for. And I think I would agree, an 8-story building probably isn't appropriate everywhere.
What kind of staffing or funding do you need for this all to happen? For you to go to the state level and help figure out coalitions, to help the legislators figure out what's needed. What kind of backing do you need to have to make this work?
Great question. First I want to say, this, for all of these bills, right? This is not just FutureWise. We're really proud to have played a big role in the successes and the shortcomings in this last legislative session. But part of what's made it successful is that there's a lot of different partners at the table that each bring different capacities. That being said, for us, being able to invest more in our state legislative advocacy has been really critical to an increase in success over the last couple of years. We have for a long time had a dedicated lobbyist in Olympia, our capital, who is really focused on sort of the inside game of building relationships with legislators, with the other lobbyists, understanding the committees and all the different steps that the bill needs to go through, knowing how to make line edits to bills quickly, all of that stuff. And I think not a lot of groups are able to have that kind of presence, and so we try and kind of provide that resource to smaller local partners. We also one of the big things that we do is we are the legal accountability mechanism for state land use law. So we also have in-house legal staff that both do legal appeals, but also advise on the kind of design of legislation. So having that additional capacity is really important.
I tried to read some of those bills, and I've been trying to do it for the last 20 years, and I still can't figure out some of them. I'm like, what does this bill actually say? There's all these hash marks and numbers at the top and whereases and whatever else. It's like ridiculous. Can you put it in plain English? I understand why you have to have legalese, but you link to a PDF of the bill and you see like all this madness, and you're like, I'm trying to figure out what this says, but I just can't.
Yeah, no, it is really complicated. And yeah, I struggle with that myself. I'm really lucky to have staff that are experts in these things that can make sure that we know what the bill is really doing and be able to do that in real time. The other thing that I think has been really big for us is in 2020, in the lead up to the 2021 legislative session, we were able to hire an organizer to be kind of the outside game to go with the inside game that we'd had for a long time. And that has just made a huge difference in being able to mobilize, individual people that wanted to get involved in advocacy, but didn't really have an avenue to do that. And also to build different kinds of partnerships with other advocacy groups so that we're not just kind of partnering with the other lobbyists. Last couple of years, it's been on Zoom, but, that are in the rooms in the Capitol, but we're also partnering with other kind of more membership-based organizations that really helping them reach their members. So, being able to invest in that and continue to invest in that capacity has been really huge for us. We also last year were able to bring on a dedicated communications position, which we had never had before. And so, that's another piece of like actually being able to have more resources to communicate about what's happening. Our organizer have been doing a lot of those communications for the state legislative work. So that's also freeing up more organizing time and putting those pieces together. I think has just been, in the big picture, this is a tiny investment, right? It's a couple $100,000 of additional capacity that I think has really made a huge difference. And I would really advocate for other organizations around the country to think about making those investments and for funders to really think about how they can contribute to making that happen.
Are you all membership driven or funder driven or a mix of the two, or organizations kind of come together and fund your work? How does that kind of work out?
We have a mix of funding. Foundations are the largest funding source for us. And then individual donors, we have a membership program that's sort of part of individual donations. We also have, a few places where we have kind of earned revenue through contracts where we're providing technical expertise on something. So we have kind of a diversified funding mix, but those are kind of the key components to it.
Another question, do you sleep?
Well, it's definitely been a busy last couple months and a busy last couple of years. You probably interviewed a lot of executive directors of small nonprofits over the years. Sleep is definitely not the first thing that happens, but actually we try really hard to have kind of a good work-life balance and good office culture and make sure that, when people are working really hard, working long hours, then they're getting a break afterwards. So, it's always a struggle to be able to maintain that, but I think it's really important.
I would agree. I appreciate the work, and I understand definitely from talking with folks, but also being at a nonprofit myself, that there's some times where you just have to ramp up and do it, and then other times you can kind of hopefully have a little bit more relaxation. Before any time before you release a report or anything like that, it's going to be madness. Yeah. But it's crazy. So with all that said, what's the progress in Washington State? And do you think that we're at a tipping point at the moment? Do you think that you've gotten to a point where the seas will change and we'll have more housing everywhere in the state?
I do think, we're making a lot of progress. And I think that this year has been a really important year in moving things forward. Even though we didn't get everything we wanted, maybe this is a good moment to kind of highlight some of the other things that happened in the legislative session. So in addition to the missing middle bill and the climate bill passing, there's kind of a host of related policies that passed One that's really important is we created something, and to be clear, Futurewise was not the lead on a lot of these, but we've been supportive and are really excited to see them happen. The state created a Covenant Homeownership Act through a $100 document recording fee on real estate transactions. This is a new fund that will go to homeownership assistance for first-time homebuyers who have experienced themselves or their family has experienced racial discrimination in access to homeownership opportunities through racially restrictive covenants in Washington state in the past. So this is really a huge kind of complement to the missing middle bill, in that the same people that have been locked out of single family neighborhoods that had a lot of these restrictive covenants aren't just going to get different housing types, but are also going to get access to financing that they've been locked out of to be able to purchase more of those homes. We also got $400 million in funding for our state housing trust fund, which primarily funds affordable rental housing, also some affordable homeownership housing. We passed an accessory dwelling unit bill that removes a lot of the restrictions on accessory dwelling units. We passed a reform of our condo liability laws. Washington state has a sort of, I think, a pretty unique issue in that we don't really build condos anymore because the legal liability for a developer on a condo is so high. And so all of our new multifamily housing, almost all of it has been rental over the last decade. And so again, that's going to be really important in intersecting with homeownership, intersecting with new opportunities to build multifamily housing. We also passed changes to our building code to allow single stair apartment buildings. So, this is going to allow better design, particularly for smaller apartment buildings, larger units, more of a sense of community in those buildings, lower costs.
That's been a big discussion lately. I feel like in the news anyways, that I see, there's been a lot of discussion about single stair and design. I also saw Charlie Munger's name today too, which made me mad. So
I don't know who that is.
The guy that wanted to do the Santa Barbara dorm without windows for some people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's a whole other issue, but somewhat.
I have not been following that, but yeah.
But yeah, what about? I think I saw this, so let me know if I'm wrong. But there was a bill about design review too, right?
Yes. So there were two more bills on my list. So design review, now there are going to be limitations. Basically, design review has to be based on sort of concrete design criteria that is not just sort of an arbitrary individual perspective on whether your design is good, but that any design review requirements that buildings have to go through has to follow kind of a clear set of guidelines, which is I think going to increase a lot of predictability and reduce timelines for projects being developed, while if anything probably doing a better job of fostering good design. And then the last big thing is that we eliminated project-based environmental review for housing projects. As long as there's an environmental impact statement for the comprehensive plan and those projects are compliant with the comprehensive plan. So that's going to be a really big deal at the permitting level. In addition to the TOD bill not passing, there were a couple other really big things that didn't happen. We had a big debate about rent stabilization, which did not pass this year. And the governor proposed a $4 billion affordable housing bond, which did not get implemented. So, there's some shortcomings this session for sure, but on housing, there's really a lot that's happened. I think it's creating a lot of momentum, both for additional work at the state level and also kind of wind at the sails of advocates at the local level to be able to push for more locally.
So I kind of want to go back and bring this back full circle to 1181, because I think that's kind of really important to think about the Russian nesting dolls of it all, and how everything that is focused on housing and creating more dense housing and those types of things creates a situation where transportation can thrive. And I think that that's really important, and kind of because one of my things about the work that I do is I think we need to talk about all these things because they're all interconnected. And if we silo off housing or transportation or environment or any of those things, we don't get the success that we might if we combine them together. So it's really important, I think, that all of these things are connected, and then also they are all kind of nested under this idea that we do want to reduce VMT and we do want to have sustainable transportation that connects everything together.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see them as super connected, and that intersection is really core to our mission. And I think we've been really, with a lot of other partners, making working hard to make the case that those two things can and should go together, that your housing costs and your transportation costs are related as a household. We can provide more housing options in places that are going to reduce both of those costs. We've been also, one of the early obstacles we had to adding climate change into our comprehensive plans was this sort of fear from the real estate development community that this was going to be like additional restrictions on development. Essentially, they sort of heard climate and environment and jumped to this, like, that's got to be anti-development, anti-housing. And so really kind of helping everybody put the pieces together and see that, like, no, actually, this is about making it easier to build in the places where we want people to build, so that we can have those benefits.
There was a piece last week in Mother Jones from Bill McKibben, who's a very famous environmentalist in the United States. And I think, kind of what his main thesis was is that environmentalism has won over the years by saying no to things. And now I think, his idea is that we need to say yes to more things. And not in the YIMBY sense of yes, but just like we need to be open to the idea that more housing actually is a good environmental income, or more of something is actually a good environmental outcome, I should say, not income. Those things actually are all tied together. And I think that that's kind of what you're talking about when you're dealing with the real estate folks, or the folks that have been used to the environmental movement saying no, but now the environmental movement, or at least a subset of them, are saying yes, and it's confusing people.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully people are going to start getting more used to that idea, because, I completely agree. The status quo is not working. And so we're going to need to change things pretty quickly. And so, that's going to mean building a lot of housing, building a lot of transmission lines and renewable energy facilities. And we are going to have to reorient our environmental regulations and laws to foster and speed that up, and still have reviews that are important, but make sure that those reviews are really targeted at the right things and understanding the trade-offs that happen and kind of the timeline that's needed.
As you look back at the session and the wins and the losses and everything that goes together, was there anything that surprised you about the process or the outcomes or the future?
I mean, everything is kind of surprising. I mean, it's surprising and not surprising. I feel like, you never really know what's going to happen. I think overall, just really thrilled to be at the point that we're at. Going into the future, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations post-session, once we've all kind of caught our breath, about the TOD bill and what would need to happen between now and January to address the challenges that we faced and come up with a path to victory for next year. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to talk to legislators, to talk to the other stakeholders in this process, and kind of see what we might be able to do differently.
Awesome. Well, where can folks find more information about what you all are up to at Futurewise?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, futurewise.org. That is the easiest place to find information about us. There's a legislative tab on our website where you can go into a deeper dive on all of the legislative work that we do. You can also see the other types of work that we're doing there. You can sign up for our mailing list on the website as well. There's a donate button if you want to make a financial contribution. And that's, I think, really the best jumping off place.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.